Thanks, Brother Ben, and good morning, brothers and sisters and young people. Thanks for inviting me to exhort for you this morning. And it's a different world, isn't it? Last time I exhorted about 12 months ago here, this was an empty hall. I've never seen Halifax Street so empty. I thought it was just the speaker last time, so apparently COVID had something to do with that. Now, the other thing you might not know about this morning, I expect we're probably going to do a fire drill. 2 out of the last 3 exhortations we've had one when I've been here, so just be ready for that. Sister Bronte and I do bring greetings from your brothers and sisters in the Riverland who meet at Glenlock. So when I was preparing this exhortation, I was drawn to consider Psalm 116, and like Ben mentioned, it's pretty powerful, some of the Psalms, and when you read them, they often have things that strike a chord with each of us. And the concept that jumped out at me was from verses 1 and 2, and that was about hearing. And I wonder today in our lives if there are just so much noise, if there is so much noise that affects our senses that sometimes we cannot hear the message of God. How many times have you gotten up really early in the morning and perhaps notice just how peacefully, quietly and almost silently the day begins? There's almost no noise at all, isn't there, really early in the morning? And because I'm a country boy, when I visit cities, I particularly notice the peace and quiet that occurs overnight in cities. The city sleeps, and then early in the morning there's that slow awakening of humanity as the morning dawns. And if you're an early riser, you will note in the first, most early stages of dawn, there's even very little traffic noise. And perhaps the only sound you'll hear will be those first early morning birds getting up and about, finding their food or getting the little baby birds awake, perhaps in their nests, commencing their own day. It's a really peaceful time of the day, isn't it? Very quiet. And then the day progresses and traffic noise occurs, more activity, and the cycle of life begins. And this can dull our peace and it can distract our mindset. So my theme for today is listen up and hear. And I think that God almost silently shouts this to us every day when the new day arises and the peaceful dawn breaks. And then the sun shines and it reminds us of God's presence and his power in our life and his desire to really have his children listen and hear him. And I wonder if Jesus was right with us this morning in person, what would he say to you and what would he say to me? He would look around and he knows us all very well. He knows the challenges you face. He knows the various levels to your faith and my faith. He knows the problems in your life. He knows the experiences you've been through. But would he really come and call you aside and say, listen up and hear? You're not listening. Are we a bit deaf, as it were? Are we distracted? Are we not hearing the voice of God? Psalm 116 verse 1 and 2 said, I love the Lord. And why? For he has heard my voice. He heard my cry for mercy. Because he turned his ear to me, I will call on him as long as I live. So the writer of the psalm expresses in the first verse that his love for God and his intention to call on him would be for his whole life. And that was because God heard him. So at this point, perhaps privately, you might consider just what your love for God is like. How genuine is your intent to call on God through your life? It's particularly strong language, and Albert Barnes, who writes a commentary on the scriptures, in these verses he says, the psalmist was conscious of love because the Lord had heard him in his prayers. And one of the reasons for his love towards God was that he had been heard And this led to that special joy of love which he felt in his soul. The main reason for loving God is his own excellency of nature. In other words, God's amazing, so we love God. Yes, we get that. But then Barnes says there are other reasons for doing it, and among them are the benefits which he has conferred on us. That table in front of me, there's a benefit that God has conferred on us, his own Son, and which, Barnes says, awaken the love of gratitude. So that brings a response. We're thankful. We appreciate what's been done for us by God. And surely each of us find some agreement with these words. The appreciation of those benefits God gives his children cause a real love and sense of gratitude to God, don't they? So today I wonder whether we should each take home perhaps that concept, that sense of gratitude that I feel to God for all the things I don't deserve that I've been given. I'm going to make that change my behaviour with the way I engage with you and the way you engage with someone else, and perhaps it can affect change in our lives. The Hebrew word for heard in verse 1 actually means to hear intelligently or to give attention. So that's quite a different word to just hearing something, isn't it? To hear intelligently. So do we give much thought to the fact that God actually listens to us? I don't think I always have. Have we thought that when we meditate, when we read, when we pray or talk to God, he hears us intelligently? It's like God's concentrating on every word or thought that you offer. It's almost like we speak or we think something and wham, God's grabbed that. He's listening to that. It's a bit like having God on speed dial. Most of us carry one of these beloved mobile phones, and most of us who are familiar with some of the technology associated with them, and particularly the Apple iPhone, has Siri, a virtual assistant. And that Siri can be activated by voice to follow commands. We might tell Siri, call Paul in my case, and with that it dials Paul. We might respond to messages through this system, and it is done. I don't want to trivialise God at all or disrespect our amazing Father in heaven. But think about that kind of immediate attention that Siri might give to a voice command is like a little part of what God does to us. That automatic, instant attention. He intelligently hears when his children speak at such a level that really makes Siri look a complete amateur. So when we think about the concept of God listening, by necessity, there's got to be something for God to listen to. And that means that we need to speak, or as David actually said in this psalm, cry at times to God. And David's a great example for us all to think about, because he's a man who rose to great spiritual heights, didn't he? He was like one with God. Sometimes heights we can't relate to. It was the type of faith that Jesus speaks about that can move mountains. But also we know that David was a man who fell into the depths of despair and very distant from his God. So we should be able to try and relate to that kind of human challenge that David faced. And David knew his mercy was directly reliant on God hearing his cry. In Psalm chapter 28, verses 1 and 2 say, and it's a psalm of David, and we read, "To you, Lord, I call. You are my rock. Do not turn a deaf ear to me. For if you remain silent, I will be like those who go down to the pit." If God's not listening, I might as well die. There's no point, is what David's saying. "Hear my cry for mercy," he says in verse 2, "as I call to you for help." And then later in that chapter, in verse 6, he says, "Praise be to the Lord, for he has heard my cry for mercy." David loved his God so deeply, and he expressed this very boldly through his praise but his love was really a lot about God listening to him. And in our lives, good communication is often considered one of the most critical aspects for a healthy relationship. If you think about a relationship failure, maybe personal, maybe professional, in the workplace, how often is poor communication involved in those problems? And I'm sure perhaps you've witnessed misunderstandings that can lead to grave consequences. And on that concept of severe consequences from bad communication, I'm going to give you 3 examples this morning that are from history. And these are examples of what can happen if people do not hear, if people do not listen, if people do not understand clearly the message. The first one I'd like to give you is the Battle of Trenton. And this occurred in December 1776, so it's a little bit before my time. It was a small but pivotal American Revolutionary War battle that took place in Trenton, New Jersey. It was the American War of Independence, and this battle was fought between George Washington and the American troops on one side, and Johann Rall and his Hessian regiments, and these were German soldiers hired to fight for the British. So they're fighting against the Americans. There are a lot of tactics that in the end led to George Washington's victory, but there's a really curious story that forms part of this battle, and it centres around the inattentive Rall, who history says preferred to be partying than fighting. And it's no good leading an army if you're a party guy instead of a soldier. One evening, he gets a spy that enters their camp who hands him a note, and he pockets it, puts it in his jacket. Thank you, no worries. He never reads this note. The note was actually found after he died in the aforementioned jacket pocket in the Trenton battle. What that note actually said was, do you want to know where the Americans are actually readying their forces, preparing for battle? Here's all the coordinates, here's what their plans are. Left it in the pocket and didn't read it. They lost the battle. It was found and read when he was dead, too late. You know, in Job 36 verse 12, we read, if they do not listen, they will perish by the sword and die without knowledge. It's exactly what happened in the Battle of Trenton in 1776. The second example of this kind of challenge that can occur if communication is not clear, or if you don't listen or I don't, and you'll all know this one very well, Captain Edward Smith. That might not trigger too much for some of you, but he crashed a rather large boat called the Titanic into an iceberg. The passenger liner known as the Titanic sunk on its maiden voyage from England to the US in 1912. It was known as the unsinkable ship, specifically designed to make the long journey from from England to America with no chance of sinking. However, one night the crew ignored warnings that in their path, where they're going, are icebergs. I think you guys should watch out. There's a heap of big icebergs ahead. Oh no, we'll be right. We've got this unsinkable ship. They went onward. The rest is history. They hit an iceberg, scrapes open the side of the boat. 1,517 people died. Proverbs 13, verse 13, the Good News Bible says, if you refuse good advice, you're asking for trouble. Follow it and you're safe. Perhaps the captain of the Titanic could have read his Proverbs. The third example of if you don't listen or heed warnings is when NASA used a metric system of measurement, whilst Lockheed Martin used an English system of measurement when they were building and collaborating together on a satellite. In 1999, a team of Lockheed Martin engineers used the English system of measurement, while the rest of the team, working on the same project, used the metric system for a Mars orbiter. The use of two different measurement systems prevented the spacecraft's navigation coordinates from being transferred from one team in Denver to the other team in California across America. The orbiter gets sent up, lost in space. NASA loses $125 million. Whoops-a-daisy. And this story actually reminded me a little bit about the Tower of Babel. In Genesis 11, the whole world has one language, one speech, we're told. Come on, let's make a big tower. Let's make ourselves really important and we can do anything. Let's make a name for ourselves is the language. God ends up saying, look, I think we need to resolve this. Let's confuse their language. They will not understand each other. And we know what happened. The Lord scattered them over the face of the earth. So they're three examples of historical communication failures that provide us of things that perhaps in our own lives we should consider. Number one, we should read and heed good counsel. Just as Rael in the Battle of Trenton didn't even read the note he was given, how often do we ignore the notes perhaps God's left for us in our lives? How often do we perhaps roll up on a Sunday and whoops, I haven't opened this Bible for a week? The notes are all there. There's great advice. We've just got to take it on board. The second example was we should listen to warnings from trusted and experienced people. Where do we get our counsel from? Where do we get our advice? Just as the crew of the Titanic ignored the warning about icebergs and thought, we've got an invincible boat, we too sometimes think we'll just sail on through life oblivious of the dangers of our surroundings at our own peril. The third thing to take on board for ourselves is to understand the language we use. Let's be clear in our spiritual community what we mean and just what really matters. Just as the builders of the Mars satellite wasted a huge amount of resources by not quite using the same measurement language, we too in our community can create division and misunderstanding by not listening to others to understand them. And also we can disrupt unity by carelessly using language that upsets others and is misunderstood. So from those three examples, surely we too should listen up and hear. And the psalmist's emotions to God are expressed exactly like this in verse 1 and 2 that we read. The Lord heard my voice. The Lord heard my cry for mercy. The Lord turned his ear to me. That's pretty powerful to think that God's actually gone, sorry? What was that? He really cranes his neck to listen to you and I, his children. Do you believe that? Wow. Think about a dearly loved friend, a family member or a spouse. If this person didn't listen when you spoke, if they ignored when you cried out for help, if they hung up on the phone whilst you're talking mid-sentence, how would you feel? I don't think it's a great sense of love and intimacy, is it? It's a pretty poor relationship. You would think my communication's not appreciated or valued, so what's the point? We are told that the psalmist loved God, and it was partly because God listened. God heard him. God understood and turned or inclined his ear towards him. So those great listening characteristics of God are surely what we need to take into our lives as responsible brothers and sisters, friends of each other. So what's the purpose of hearing? According to sitemd.com, which must be correct because it's online, and that's where a farmer goes for medical advice, hearing refers to our ability to perceive noise and sounds. Your hearing is used to listen to music, talk to people around you, and assess social and environmental situations. So hearing allows us to perceive noise and sound. It allows us to talk to others and communicate, two-way communication. There's that old saying, we've got two ears and one mouth, we should use them in sort of that order, listen twice as much as we speak. We can assess situations, we can listen. And in fact, you're all hearing my voice today through that very process. And park the guy speaking aside for a moment, but are we really listening? Or are we just hearing blah, blah, blah? Are we hearing God's message? Are we hearing it in our own lives? The value of hearing in daily life is priceless, and it's perhaps only once we have a bit of hearing loss or difficulties with our health that we appreciate these faculties. The value of hearing allows us to assess our environment, including dangers, warning, imminent trouble, or guidance from another person. For example, in a workplace that uses machinery, it's often the change in sound of either an engine or a machine that alerts the machine operator to a potential problem or breakdown. And if the machine operator hears a strange noise develop and ignores that warning sound, the machine probably will break down, but actually could cause an accident and great disruption and problems. And we've all seen examples of that. You know, that funny sound under your car as you're driving along that you ignore and get to the other end and you've ruined a good tyre because you didn't pull over and stop in time. And it can also be where a person's facing imminent danger and they can't hear a warning from someone else. And in our day and age, this is a classic problem because most people are wearing earbuds, right? So we're crossing the street and we say, "Whoa, stop! That truck's coming, it's about to hit you." Didn't hear it, whack, see you later. All over. And that's a common challenge because are we in our own world? Are we not hearing our environment? Are we not perceiving, as it were? Do we risk losing the ability to perceive because we don't listen up and hear our God? Psalm 139 verse 2 says, "You know when I sit up and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar." So in our lives, do we hear the voice of God? And how do we do that? Well, in the past, people of the Bible, they actually heard God's voice. They actually saw physical miracles. We don't see that level of intervention in our lives, do we? And so our challenge is to really listen and hear the voice of God every day in our life. Jesus clearly did this, and it helped him have a really intimate relationship with his Father, and he heard his Father's voice. Isaiah 50 verse 4 is speaking about Jesus really. It's forecasting what the relationship between God and Jesus would be. And it says, "The sovereign Lord has given me a well-instructed tongue to know the word that sustains the weary. He wakens me morning by morning, wakens my ear to listen like one being instructed." So there's that picture of God almost putting the right words on his tongue to say. And how often do we say the wrong thing and we wish we could grab it back, but it's gone. Jesus had the right thing on his tongue to say. But even more than that, every morning it's like God was just reaching in and giving him special information and advice in his ear. Or in our life, if we think about it, what's coming into our ear canal, as it were? What are we listening to and hearing? Have we got our noise-cancelling headphones, filling our minds with other things, with things that dull our perception? Of course, there's value in us using that technology, and I do think that if there is an upside to the last sort of 14, 15 months of the COVID challenges we've all faced, perhaps many of us have actually found more online content and started listening to that through the week of a spiritual nature. I know for myself, it's forced us to go online. We couldn't meet like this many times. So there's so much material online, and you can be travelling or walking and listening to something spiritual to motivate you and encourage you. So we can listen up and hear every day. It's like God could awaken our ears morning by morning. The other question I asked myself when thinking about this hearing is, can hearing be improved? And of course I went to myhearing.com, which must be reliable, but what it said is, it's well known that exercise has enormous benefits for your health, But few people realise the impact it can have on your hearing, and that exercise is actually one way to improve your hearing. When you exercise, the blood flow to your ears increases. I guess that makes sense, but I'd never thought of that before. So I thought this was quite surprising. When you exercise, your hearing is improved by the increase of blood flow through the ears. I wonder if there's a spiritual connection here. Can we have a fitness program to improve our spiritual hearing? If we exercise, our hearing improves. If we exercise spiritually, our spiritual hearing probably improves as well. So if we listen to God's word, it probably makes more sense to us than if we don't listen to it at all. It's the old phrase, use it or lose it. Let's exercise our spiritual opportunities before it's too late. Psalm 145 says, the Lord is near to all who call on him. To all who call on him in truth. He fulfills the desires of those who fear him. He hears their cry and saves them. Just as hearing and listening is important for us to develop in our lives, so too is our communication with God. And Ben's done that very well for us this morning. We've actually expanded our thinking, not just to our believers in this city, but globally. And that's powerful, isn't it? To think of that global community that we're part of. Jesus told his disciples in Luke 18 they should do something, because if they didn't do it, they might as well give up. You know what it was, don't you? They should always pray and not give up. What this is really insinuating is that if you stop praying, you've given up. Paul also reinforces that concept in 1 Thessalonians 5, where he says, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances. So we do need to work on our prayer lives too, I'm sure. God provided advice to the Jews at the baptism of his son, and that's really our focus today. And if we were to take the cloth off now, you know what we'd be looking at. Red wine representing Jesus' blood that was spilled for you and I. He didn't deserve that. We don't deserve it either. The mercy and the love. The bread representing his life, a perfect life given to others. All the things we need to do in our lives. Imagine being part of the baptism of Jesus, being one of those witnesses on the lakeside, and that voice from heaven that booms out, this is my beloved son, listen to him. Listen to him. It's almost like God saying, listen up and hear. Jesus is here now. You focus on this man. And so Jesus did in his life. He listened to his Father. We know he went up on mountains to pray. He got away from it all. He took out all the noise, all the background noise, and allowed himself to focus. It motivated him. It strengthened him. It empowered him. So we'll conclude this morning by just looking at a little section in Hebrews. And there's a couple of sections. Chapter 2, verse 1 says, we must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we've heard, so that we do not drift away. It's critical. It's important. Just like those people in history that didn't listen or didn't take advice, the consequences were pretty severe. Some people died. We must pay careful attention, because if we don't, we're just going to drift away. Sounds like listen up and hear. But the ultimate example of this is right in front of us in these emblems, and it's Jesus, our merciful Saviour, where in Hebrews chapter 5, verse 1 and 2, and then verse 7 says the following. Every high priest is selected from among the people. This was in the days of the Old Testament, wasn't it? And the high priest is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. And you think about Jesus this morning. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray. That's you, that's me. We know that. Since he himself is subject to weakness. And then it concludes, verse 7, that during the days of Jesus' life on earth, what did he do? What was his secret? He offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death, and he was heard. So let's remember Jesus and determine in our lives to listen up and hear.